Passage, which is from the beginning of a new book by today's speaker, Albert Flynn DeSilver. He says, "A brilliant writer is someone who is devoted to expressing their creativity through the written word. Devotion is the key. I like to say a writer is someone who writes, not someone who has published. Practice, repetition, and consistency are essential. This book is designed to help you master all three. And because writing is not a separate activity from living, it's ultimately a book about being with a capital B, about the integration of life and art." So I think that tells you a lot about the person who's going to be talking to us today. His book, Writing as a Path to Awakening, was born out of his popular workshops by the same name. His book offers practical insights, innovative exercises, and fun anecdotes about the joys and challenges of the writing life. And his talk today is based on the book. This is actually Albert's second appearance at CWC. He first spoke here 6 years ago in February 2012 before the publication of his memoir, Beamish Boy, which he has copies of here. He's an internationally published poet, memoirist, novelist, speaker, and workshop leader. He's written several books of poems in addition to the memoir. He served as Marin County's very first poet laureate, and he shared the stage with a number of acclaimed writers. He teaches at various educational organizations and writing conferences nationally. And I checked it out, he also presented a TED Talk, which you can watch on YouTube, on creating an open poetic identity. So I'm very excited to be inspired today, and I hope that you will please join me in welcoming Albert Flynn DeSilver.
Thank you so much, Audrey and CWC Peninsula. A delight to be back here, and I should make a slight correction that the TED Talk was really a TEDx talk, which is like TED Light. And it's funny because I was just telling Dave, who saw me speak up at the Redwood Writers Conference a couple years ago, that he saw me speak there, and he said, "I don't know what you said, but it was a terrific talk." and I was reminded of what fun I had at that talk, because about a year before that, I'd given this TEDx talk, and it totally bombed. Like completely, I mean, if you watch the video, you'll think, oh, that's fine, I did okay. But they edited out the part where I completely blanked and said, "Guess that's it." And pretty much just ran off the stage, completely mortified. And I love that Dave said, I don't remember what you said. So in a way, it's like, it's not about that. You know, it's how you say it. So hopefully I'll say it like in a way that you remember. So it's almost like, you know, and you kind of learn this stuff from, if you go to any kind of speaking school or workshops or anything, that it's about gesture, it's about presence, and for me it's about showing up authentically. So that's what I hope to do today. And I want to talk a little bit about the book. And this just came out in September, Writing as a Path to Awakening. And this is sort of my manifesto on writing after about 20 years of doing this, mostly in the genre of poetry for about 15 years. And then Audrey mentioned the memoir, which came out in 2012. And then I've written 1.5 novels. The first novel is out for sale as we speak. But notice I do call myself a novelist, even though I have not published a novel. And the reason for that is to claim that identity. And I think that's important as writers. You know, one of the things I hear over and over again at my writing retreats and workshops is that people say, kind of smug, I don't know if I'm a writer. And this whole bit about a writer is someone who writes is really important. I mean, claiming that identity is important. I think it empowers us. It gives us a sense like, yeah, I can do this. And in my experience, it's very true. You know, the publishing part is nice and it's fun if you want to connect with a larger audience and have that larger kind of interactive communication culturally and socially. But it's not necessary. You know, there's lots of people who write, they keep journals, and they write to connect with themselves, to understand their emotional world, and to evolve spiritually and emotionally through that practice. Because writing is one of the most powerful points we have of focus as human beings. It's like all this attention and energy kind of just goes streaming out of our hearts and minds, out of our bodies, onto the page. And zoom, things become manifest. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons that goal setting is so powerful, and intention setting. And when you get specific about that goal, those goals, and you get specific about your intentions in the world, like what you want in your life, in terms of money, in terms of career, in terms of relationship, in terms of spiritual connection. And when you write that down specifically, things become manifest. It's kind of miraculous. And so this is the power of writing. And now, of course, that's a very different kind of writing than writing a novel or writing a poem. But I think the key thing to remember is that the power differential is no less, right? I mean, I love when people talk about the power of fiction to tell the greatest truths. Isn't that interesting? Because fiction is what? Lies. It's like invention, totally made up. And yet there's these human truths that just like bubble to the surface and resonate in our heart and our minds. And this is the great wonder of fiction. And this is why I've started to write novels, just to see, well, first of all, can I even do this? So it's like a grand experiment. And I think this is a great approach to writing in general, to be curious. Be curious about yourself. Who am I? Who am I through this practice of writing? Who do I become through this practice of writing? Because it's not just about the writing. You know, it's about how you have to show up in the world to back those words up. You know, if you start to get that work out in the world, if you want to do that. And my general assumption, and you can correct me if this is untrue, but if you're a member of CWC, you're interested in writing and publishing. Is that true? Yes?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. I mean, it might be true that some of you just love the art of writing and want to keep journals and have writing in your life that way, which I think is completely legitimate and wonderful and to be celebrated. And you never know what can arise from that. Devotion. Perfect example. And it's actually in the book, there's a terrific writer named Robin Rahm who wrote a memoir a number of years ago called The Mercy Papers. And this started as a journal. The last 3 weeks of her mother's life, she kept this journal. She went back to Oregon to take care of her mom and to be with her for these last few weeks that she was in hospice care. And she kept this journal. She brought her dog Mercy along, and she just was journaling, like processing how to deal with this incredible loss. And the journal got very rich and deep because she's a good writer. She had written a novel before, but she wasn't going to publish this thing. But her friends were like, wow, this is really good. You could shape this into a memoir. And so she did, and she called it The Mercy Papers, a memoir of 3 weeks. And I thought that was so interesting, like that a memoir, a 3-week period, can encapsulate like a whole book. You know, and encapsulate a lot of truths about loss and relationship and connection to mother and daughter. And it's, a number of years ago, I was in a workshop, and someone asked us to bring in great starts, great beginnings, your favorite beginnings to certain books. And I brought that. The first page, there's a description of the hospice nurse. Just amazing. It's so emotional. And it's so emotional because of the details. She gets right to the heart of describing the particulars of how this hospice nurse looks. Her hair styled as a hunting cap, her bluish teeth, the way that she needs to be startled. It's like this incredible passage. And it gets us into the the story gets us into her pain, like right off the bat. And it's filled with this interesting judgment in a way about the hospice nurse. And yet you realize right off the bat that it's just because she's grieving her mother. It's not because she dislikes this hospice nurse. I mean, the hospice nurse, she's probably seen 10 families that day. And they're all, I mean, I used to work in the home care industry, and so total chaos, right? I mean, this is what happens when we're grieving. Not all of us can hold it together in these very dark and difficult times. So there's often a lot of chaos. And the hospice nurses are there to like kind of ground things and ground the family and keep things together and be professional. And yet, you know, as a family member, where are you going to put your grief? Like, where am I going to put it? So I'm going to put it on the page, and I'm going to write about this hospice nurse, or the people that are like in the immediate vicinity. It wasn't just the hospice nurse, but then she starts describing an interaction at one point in the book where she just goes to buy something at an electronics store because her phone died or something like that, and she can't get the right part, and the person behind the counter is being really difficult, and she just loses it. And it's just this amazing moment of human connection where you're like, oh yeah, I can totally relate to that. So that's what I think the power of writing really lies in, this ability to inhabit our own emotions and our own truth, to share that with the world. For a long time, when I contemplated writing a memoir, and how many memoir writers do we have? Raise your hand. A few of you, okay. Personal essay? Novel writing? Poetry? Script writing? A couple script writers, awesome. What am I leaving out? Anyways, this is this is true really for any genre, but when I contemplated writing this book, I was, you know, like, who cares about my little story? You know, I'm nobody famous. I'm not that interesting of a person. I've been through some things. I had some adventures. But really, like, who wants to read about my story? And I thought, like, I would have to start telling about those particular truths, like telling all that wisdom that I learned, first off. But really, it became about the particularities of my experience and noticing those subtle little details in daily life that transformed me, that changed me. And so it became this whole process of writing the story to let go of the story. And at first, I didn't think that I would publish this thing. You know, like Robin, I was sort of keeping it a little bit as a journal, but really as a way just to explore, like, what is this thing, memoir? Can I even do this? And what will this do for me, just in terms of my healing, or in terms of my study of writing, of being a writer? Because I've been writing poetry for so long, for about 15 years, I wasn't sure if I could complete a sentence. Honestly, right? Because you're writing in lines, you're so used to writing in lines, which aren't sentences, and you can do anything. And I started as kind of like this avant-garde experimental poet, and so I was pretty far out there. So this whole idea of threading together a cohesive narrative was very alien to me. I was like, how do people do that? So I got to work studying. And you know, in some ways that's the easy part, right? Like, there's so many great books out there on story structure, which is essential for memoir, which is essential for script writing, which is essential for novels. Not so much for poetry, but there are some levels of structure that are good for poetry. So you can learn all that stuff. You can figure that out. You can go to good workshops. But the hard work, I think, is going inside. Going into the grief, going into the difficult emotions. And so that's really what this book is all about. Writing as a path to awakening, and it's like awakening to what? Awakening to presence. Awakening to emotional reality. awakening to the true full hurt and the true full bliss of being a human. That's the journey, and that's why there's meditations. And it doesn't matter like if you come from a Christian tradition or you're drawn to a Christian tradition or an Islamic tradition or a Judaic tradition or a Hindu tradition or a Buddhist tradition. Find that way in. Find that contemplative way in, beyond belief, beyond idea, beyond perception. What is that place? And who am I there? That's really what this book asks you to do. And it takes a huge act of courage to do that, I think. But I think ultimately being a writer is an act of courage. Like stepping into your voice, into your truth, and being willing to share that with the world, that's a courageous act. So I'm going to commend you all right off the bat. Nicely done. You know, just showing up for it, I think is huge. And so never stop patting yourself on the back. Not in an egoic way, but support yourself, right? Because at times, not that many other people will. Like in my experience, it's like, there's some lonely times out there, right? But no one really cares. No one really cares about my novel or my memoir or my dorky little poem. I mean, sometimes they do, maybe. But it is a difficult road, and I think we need support. We need ways to nourish ourselves along this difficult journey. And so the book is broken into these 12 chapters, and there's a writing exercise. Well, first there's a meditation exercise, because that's a great way to lead you in to the writing, kind of opening up your sense of possibility. And then there's a writing exercise. And then sprinkled throughout, there's all these little like, try this, try that, try this. And see how you can apply them to your own specific genre, your own style of writing, whatever that is for you. And the book is also themed, beginning in January, going through all the 12 months of the year. So January is rebirth, February is becoming, March is emergence, poetry is blossoming, etc. And the reason for that is just to kind of thematically propel you along this journey. I mean, you can enter anywhere, right? But it's nice to have that kind of support of a theme to see how that might touch off some ideas in your own experience, in your own writing practice. So how about a few words from the book? Rather than trying to explain the book, I'll just read from it. So I'd like to read to you from April, which is blossoming, and talking about poetry as the language of possibility. But this is my favorite chapter because I'm a little biased, genre-wise, towards poetry. Having written poetry for so long and continuing to write poetry, having taught as a California poet in the schools for many years, which was great. I say taught, but really I learned from all the kids, because it's all about kids writing, giving them the opportunity to write from their soul, from their heart, which is a total revelation. You know, when I was a kid, no one ever gave us that chance. They were like, here, memorize this poem. It's like, really? Do I have to? You know, I mean, as nice as that is, it's not the same thing as giving a kid a pen and a sense of possibility and saying, hey, I want to listen to you. I want to hear what's in your heart. You know, what are your struggles, your challenges? What are your joys? How do you connect to nature? And here's some tools. This thing called metaphor, this thing called simile. Play around with that. Let's have some fun with words. And they write the most amazing stuff. Here, let me read you an example. This was a student of ours from, I think she was in Mill Valley. Caroline Calhoun, who's now 25, but she was a third grader at the time. She wrote this poem called Secrets. Turquoise laughter, an eagle in the sky, a butterfly whispering in a dragonfly's ear. The angels peering in the corner window, just like a poet, weaving her story on a loom of sawdust.
A third grader?
Yeah, how about that? I know, we're like, oh, forget it. I'll never write again. But this is the kind of thing, and I saw that, I chose this poem in particular because it was very bright and very original. But I came across this stuff weekly. Every week, there were kids in the class that would just, their imagination was just billowing forth. Especially when they got a sense of possibility and that they weren't going to be graded or judged. It's like, no, we're celebrating your imagination. Go for it. And here's some cool models. I'd read them other kids' poems and they'd be like, whoa, one of my colleagues wrote that? That's cool. And the boys equally with the girls. I think in our culture there's that bifurcation. When guys think that poetry is not that cool. And so I would show up and tell them that it was cool, and they were like, I don't believe you. I'd be like, no, seriously, check this out. And eventually they would come around. And that was my thing, to get everyone writing. And it worked. Most kids wrote. And the resistant ones, if I just stepped away and said, oh, okay, there's no assignment here. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Eventually they would get curious. They'd be like, what is everyone else kind of speaking from their soul? It's natural, right? This need to express, it's what makes us human. So I believe that anybody can do this, I really do. And I've seen this not only with the kids, but with adults in my workshops. And this is the beautiful thing about meditation practice, is it breaks down it's actually a combination between the meditation practice and free writing, stream of consciousness writing, whatever you want to call it, where you're not like overthinking it. You're just allowing what's there in the immediacy of your experience to come out on the page, directly from your body, not so much as from your head and all your brilliant ideas. Like, it's amazing what happens when you let go of all those brilliant ideas and let in the natural wisdom of your body. Let that come out on the page. That's friggin' amazing. You don't even recognize it. And I see this in my workshops. People are just so surprised. They're like, whoa, where'd that come from? It came from you. This is who you are. You don't stop at your conception of yourself. The great American poet Carl Sandburg once wrote that poetry is an echo asking a shadow to dance. Poetry is an echo asking a shadow to dance. Love that. I didn't actually write that twice in the book, but I thought I'd read it twice just to, for emphasis, right? Now that definition doesn't bring us any closer to an understanding of what poetry is, nor does it make much sense in the traditional logical meaning of the word sense. But is it sensory? Does it spark your imagination? Does it open your heart and mind, your bodily awareness? Does it trigger a hunger for deeper exploration? As intellectual, ego-driven humans, we want to figure it out. We want to know what things mean. What could Sandburg's definition possibly mean? And maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. And that's precisely the point. We can't do anything with it. We can't buy it or sell it or even figure it out. It's simply strange and beautiful. It incites a kind of urging curiosity and wonder, sparks the miracle of the imagination in this moment, which then becomes a moment of mystery and possibility. This is the power of poetry, to incite awe and wonder, to inspire great writing. Now, what if we replace the word poetry in Sandburg's definition with the word I? As in, I am an echo asking a shadow to dance. Doing so, we become an agent of energy, an object of curiosity and wonder, a generator of imagination and possibility. This is the role of poetry and all writing, to serve as the conduit for an evolutionary and inspirational consciousness. This is writing as a path to awakening. And it kind of begins with poetry for me. It's the ground of all great writing. And if you think about the highest compliment that's usually given, to any sort of writing, or any kind of art, really, they say it's poetic, right? That play was poetic. And what do they mean? They mean that there's something deeper, some like soul particularity that just emerges from the work that really sparks us, that keeps that mystery alive for us. And I think that's what poetry means. But it's not that you can't bring that into your novel, or into your personal essay, or your magazine article. But poetry is where it begins, I think. You know, that richness of particular language, the use of metaphor and simile, the use of really active, hyperbolic verbs, personification, all that stuff enlivens all kinds of great writing. I remember when I was doing my memoir study in advance of writing my own memoir, and I was reading Mary Karr. And if you've ever read Mary Karr, you realize like every line is like a poetic line. It's like incredible. And then you learn that she's written a lot of poetry in her time. She actually, I think she has like 3 or 4 books of poetry. But you just never really hear about them because her memoirs are so popular. But that's just it. And you think, excuse me, I think of my favorite songwriters, like Bob Dylan, for example, or Joni Mitchell. They read poetry. They read poetry. You know, it becomes this inspiration for the particularities of their genre. And I know we have a difficult relationship to poetry in our culture because we don't, this whole thing about not understanding it. Yeah. It's obscure, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't tell a story necessarily. And I think it's that we're looking at it from the wrong perspective. You know, that we're expecting it to do a certain thing, like tell us a story or be narrative or go from point A to point B to point C. And that's not what poetry is about. It's about this mystery of awareness, these imaginative leaps that we can't necessarily understand, and yet there's some communication happening. This mystery of awareness is bubbling forth. And so I think we can do that in, as I say, in any kind of genre. So how about, I want to read another little section of the book about, because you mentioned devotion, you read that little thing about devotion, I do think this is so important. Commitment is almost everything in writing, or anything else for that matter. I mean, you think about how you became good at anything, you came back to it over and over and over again, even when you didn't want to, even when it was tedious, even when it was arduous. But when you keep the thread of curiosity alive in your heart, even the editing becomes interesting, because you never know what's going to happen. That's part of the mystery of consciousness, is that it's always changing. And if we can get curious about ourselves and how things change within our hearts and minds, then even the editing becomes really exciting and really interesting. Not that there aren't going to be times when it's just laborious. It's just hard. You know, you got to trudge through. It's just grim, right? And yet, we can bring that curiosity forward. And I think it helps us get through those really tricky editing parts. I mean, I can't even tell you how many drafts this thing went through. Thank God for editors. This was really amazing. This was actually the first time that I've had an assigned team. You know, Sounds True is awesome. They gave me an editor. They gave me multiple editors. Copy editor, they gave me a structural editor.
Today, to write my journal, I always find something that I think is funny.
Beautiful. Yeah, and this is so great to get kind of clarity on that. Like, what is my intention around this? What do I want to do with this book? And I was actually just talking to a coaching client that I have who we were sort of discussing this whole idea of purpose. Like, what's the point? Why am I really doing this? Why am I being devoted to this practice of writing in the first place? Like, what do I want to do with it? What do I want to get out of it personally? What do I want to share with the world? And, you know, we all could really use more laughter, more insight, more wisdom, more compassion, more empathy. You know, I think that the writer's role in this time is to make those connections. And that's what metaphor is all about. It's all about relationship, making connections between unlike things, making bridges, building bridges through our writing. And laughter is number one, right? That's great. Thank you for sharing that. The question, yes.
It's not a question, just a
Please go
comment.
ahead. Yeah.
I would piggyback on both the laughter and the obscure, dense poetry. I write to be a balm, to be a comfort, to be a peace, and even joy is almost too much of a happy word. Just a comfort.
Right.
So I think that's what poetry does for me, and that's what I would hope poetry does for someone else. Give solace, give comfort, give connection, recognition.
Yeah.
Those are the words that come to my mind.
Well, and think of who's like the number one best-selling poet in America right now?
Mary Oliver?
Maybe. I think it might be Rumi, who was writing in the 12th century, or maybe the 13th century, the 1200s, I think. But isn't that interesting? You know, he's sort of writing from this language of like this timeless, cultureless language that reaches us all. And I think Mary Oliver certainly is sort of like in that tradition in some kind of a way. As a contemporary writer, you know, she's very accessible. She's not opaque. So if you want some great, direct, beautiful poetry that's very accessible, Mary Oliver, I think, is your gal. Also, someone who's very unassumingly clear of mind is W.S. Merwin, who I love. And I used to not like Merwin or Oliver for that matter. I thought they were almost like too direct, like too simple. But that was my young, like, gotta be arty self. Now as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little softer. And this whole idea of like communicating, I remember my dad used to say to me, well, the whole point is that you're communicating with people. It's like, nobody understands this, when he would look at my poetry. Well, I understand it. Or at least I don't understand it enough to make it important to me, whatever that means. Yeah.
Whatever happened to rhyming poetry, the way I used to read it and write it? And now it's all free verse or blank verse or whatever you want to call it, and you don't see rhyming poetry anymore.
Well, certainly not so much in the New Yorker, but it's out there. You know, there's people who are still very much devoted. And who was it I heard on the radio the other day? Who's very much like a classic traditional rhyming poet. And it's not coming to me right now. But I think that there's so many different schools out there. There's so many different little communities where you can find your community. I mean, there's haiku communities of writers and online, and I mean, you could be part of that solution of bringing it back. You know, bring back that rhyme. I think it's just, you know, culturally it's sort of evolving in different ways. People are playing with sound and they're playing with rhyme in new ways. But, you know, there's something about that good old-fashioned rhyme in poetry that's very nice. That's very much, I mean, think about like a lot of pop music comes out of that tradition. I mean, that's how you almost can't write a good good contemporary song without having those fairly standard rhymes. It's true. You know, what's interesting too is that Kay Ryan, who was U.S. Poet Laureate a few years ago, she lives up in Marin actually, and one of her great inspirations is Ogden Nash. And you wouldn't know it necessarily. I mean, her poetry is it's kind of like that, but it's a little bit, she kind of shifts things contemporarily in a way that just makes it her own, but heavily influenced by him for sure. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I have a sort of question / comment. I have been doing sort of free writing in the morning for a couple of years, and when I first started it was revelatory and amazing, and I was like, wow, I can't believe I haven't been doing this. And I have run into a challenge recently where because it's something very familiar to me now, I have to really fight against this sort of I don't know, automaticity, or, you know, I sit down and getting back to that place where I was when I first started doing it is getting more challenging. And one thing that I've tried that I just keep coming back to is that when you say, I think you've said specificity or particularity many times, and that's really the key for me is, you know, when it starts to be sort of, oh, here I am doing this thing again, you know, it's like, no, where am I right now? What is happening? But, you know, I'm sitting at the same table that I sit at every morning looking at the same view, but getting into that very specific thing that's happening that day. So I just wanted to throw that out there for people who may find themselves in that same situation.
Yeah, and it's sort of like that, right? With our writing, even with the free writing, it can become very familiar. But I think we also need to keep challenging ourselves and almost narrowing the scope in terms of the detail, like honing in even closer and closer and closer. and see what's there. You know, the other thing that's interesting about the meditation thing is it kind of opens up this whole other realm of our minds and our hearts and our emotional experience that we may not have been privy to in the past. So then when we come to the writing with that experience, that's why I love writing out of meditation. It's almost like you're writing out of a different and a new state of consciousness. And it's almost like there's more available, there's more knowledge available somehow. And also reading is super important. Like, how is the reading that we're doing influencing our writing? Because in the book I talk about this, that reading is writing, writing is reading. They're like part of the same thing. You can't become a better writer without reading. It's just impossible. And so we have to be conscious of what we're reading and read widely, read diversely. And I like to read within my genre to kind of help just keep me going through the tough parts, the parts where I don't know. Like, I don't know how to write a novel. Like, I really don't. But if I read enough novels, I'll start getting a sense of what that is, of how to keep a story together, of what makes characters shine, of what makes me laugh in a certain story. And then I can always go read like Donald Mass's book on writing breakout fiction, you know, or whatever book it is that kind of tells you, here are some different components of story structure. Here are some components of character development. And you're going to interpret that in your own way, right? As it fits your particular style and your experience. But all that stuff is going to keep it fresh. So when you go back to the page, it becomes interesting, it becomes lively. And sometimes it's just not going to be that way. Sometimes it's just going to be boring. It's like, you know, it's like with our own awareness, our own beingness. Sometimes we're bright, sometimes we're lively, sometimes we're dull, sometimes we're boring. And can both things be true? It's like with anything, like in this world of ours, there's great, immense tragedy. We're seeing it almost every day, every week out in the world. If you're listening to the news, God help you. But it's, right? There's just like immense tragedy and deceit and confusion and separation. And yet, there's great beauty. There's incredible connection. People are doing phenomenal, mind-blowing, beautiful things in the world every moment. I can look out here into this yacht club and see the water rippling, the reflection of the water, and it just lights me up. So can both of those things be true in our experience? Can we hold both of them as true in our experience? And what does that do? I think it was Liz Gilbert in her terrific book, Big Magic. She talks about how writing is both a crushing chore and a sublime commitment, or I forget the words she uses. But that idea that, yeah, it's a crushing chore. And it's a beautiful, incredible discovery. How do we embody, how do we inhabit, how do we surrender to both of those realities, to that truth? That's the question. Should we leave it there? I have no idea what time it is. Books are here, and I'm happy to sign books and hang out for a while and chat. Thank you so much again for having me. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I didn't miss one of these. Good. Thank you.
Do you want it signed?
Yes, please.
To your name?
Yes. Help me with inspiration. Sure, I would love to have it.
Thank you. Do you want it signed?
To Dana?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks for offering this as a process. Okay. Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah. Absolutely. Congratulations.
I hope you'll sign this if you don't mind. My name is Laura, Laura. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd
I
love to
look
hear
forward
what you think.
Yeah, I'd love to read. Look
Enjoy.
forward to reading it. Thank you.
I know, it's nice. It's looking pretty good.
Sometimes I like to share the books. And maybe it's just the...
Thank you. I had a great time today. Yes, really inspirational.
Very sweet.
You'll see, success is now accessible.
Yes, it is. Beautiful. I appreciate that.
Do you have another local workshop coming up?
I do, down at 1440 in Santa Cruz.
Oh, I've heard about
It's
that.
a weekend intensive. It's going to be awesome. I've been hearing all these amazing things about the place. Like they have an infinity pool and all this like trails through redwoods and organic food and
Well, basically, I mean, to me, I'm basically like trying to publish my first book.
I completely